webinars. This is a lesson about Noon Saakin and how we apply the terms Ghunna, Idh-haar, Idgham, Ikhfaa and Iqlaab to Noon Saakin. Objectives: to understand what the term Ghunna means, to understand the actual meanings of the terms Idh-haar, Idgham, Ikhfaa and Iqlaab, and to understand how these terms apply to Noon Saakin and Noonation. Okay, that's the Tanween. And we're going to analyze quite a few examples from the Holy Quran. Just a note here, this is a basic level of understanding, so we're covering the absolute essentials of these topics. Ghunna. So Ghunna is in English nasalization. So here we have it written in Arabic, Ghunna, and the formal definition: it is a sound that is emitted from the nasal passage without any function of the tongue. This is when a certain sound is held in the nasal cavity. That's why it's called nasalization. And really, you could think of this as humming. So if you just hum like you'll see your tongue doesn't move, and the motion of the humming is done in your nasal cavity. And that's a bit like the Ghunna. Now for the length, normally in Tajweed, when you have a Ghunna, you hold the length of the sound for two longs in relation to the length of one length, which is your normal single fatha, kasra or dhamma. If you listen carefully though to reciters, when they do the Ghunna, they sometimes hold it for a bit longer because it's the real beautification of your recitation. So we've got to pay a lot of attention to these. Now we're going to cover some terminologies, and at the moment we're just seeing the terminologies in their literal sense, i.e. what's the literal meaning of these terms, and then we're going to see how they're applied specifically to Noon Saakin and Tanween. So the first one we're going to cover is Idgham. So Idgham means to assimilate a sound into another sound. Normally it is assimilating the sound of a vowel sound of one letter into the sound of the next letter, so i.e. combining the sound of a letter into the next letter. This may involve nasalization or it may not. So Idgham can sometimes be done with Ghunna and sometimes without. Idh-haar means to pronounce a word clearly and distinctly, i.e. normally. So when we apply this Idh-haar to our recitation in certain circumstances, it means we're just reciting it as normal, clearly and distinct. Then we have Iqlaab, which comes from the word qalb, which means to turn. In terms of Tajweed, it is used when the sound of a letter is turned into the sound of another letter. And the last one is Ikhfaa, which is to hide a sound. And the way you hide it is done differently depending on what you're trying to hide. So in this lesson we'll obviously see this applied to the Noon Saakin. Okay, now we're going to look at specifics for the Noon Saakin. So in terms of the Ghunna, nasalization, we've been through the formal definition. What we need to know is when this nasalization is done, and one of these circumstances is when the letter Noon is Mushaddad, i.e. it carries a shadda. Whenever Noon carries a shadda, it will always be recited with a Ghunna. So here we have the Noon Mushaddad, i.e. carrying a shadda, and we've color coded it in green to indicate that nasalization is going to be done. So in terms of our makharij diagrams, when we're talking about the Noon Mushaddad, the makhraj is exactly the same. So our tongue is still where we would normally put it for the noon, and we've covered that in previous lessons on the makharij. However, the actual sound is moving up into the nasal cavity, i.e. into your nasal passage. So the makhraj is the same, but we're effectively vibrating the sound in our nasal cavity. So that would be the Ghunna of the Noon Mushaddad, and we'll do an example next. So here we have a simple example. So here we have a simple example of the Noon Mushaddad, and this word is inna. Okay, so we know how the shadda operates, i.e. gemination. However, we now, because we know the rule is whenever we have a noon with shadda, we must apply the ghunna. So instead of just saying inna, so we know we hold it for 2, but now we're going to apply the ghunna. So this should be inna, inna. Okay, so it's just holding that sound in the nasal cavity. Now we're going to look at tanween. So fatha tanween, kasra tanween, and dhamma tanween effectively have the noon sakin in them. Hence, the rules for noon sakin also apply to tanween. So let's do a recap on this. So dhammatain is actually the oo sound with the noon sound added to it, so you get un. Equivalent of writing that separately, i.e. writing the dhammatain out separately, would be the hamza with the dhamma and noon sakin, so we get un. So that's the same sound as the tanween, i.e. dhammatain. So we can see you get this hidden noon sakin within that dhammatain. Same with the kasratain, it equals the hamza with kasra and noon sakin. And we have the same with fathatain, which is the hamza with fatha and noon sakin. So all of these tanweens actually have a noon sakin in them. Hence we're going to apply the same rules to the tanween that we do to the noon sakin. Okay, now we'll break this down and we're going to go over the rules, and then we're going to see examples of each one independently, and we'll go through each rule in more detail. So this is a summary of what we're about to do. So whenever noon sakin or tanween is followed by any of these rules that we're about to look at, then we have to do something special. So the first one, if noon sakin or tanween is followed by any of the throat letters,